In 2009, a man in Florida entered a photo manipulation contest on a comedy website. He didn't win, but the image he submitted, a black and white photograph of children playing in a park with a tall, thin, faceless figure barely visible in the background, would eventually be connected to the attempted murder of a 12-year-old girl in Wisconsin. To understand how, you have to go back to a Saturday morning in 2014. And to understand that morning, you have to understand two things: who Peyton Leitner was and what happened to that image after it left Florida. Peyton Leitner was 12 years old, and she had grown up in Waukesha, a mid-sized city west of Milwaukee, with the quiet suburban feeling of a place where kids still rode bikes to each other's houses and stayed out until it got dark. At school, Peyton was gentle, friendly, and easy to have in class. She had parents who looked out for her, friends she trusted, and one best friend who had been in her life for so long that Peyton could barely remember what life had looked like before her. That best friend was Morgan Geyser. From the outside, Morgan could be warm and funny and a little intense in the way some kids are intense when they really care about something. When Morgan loved a subject, she had this way of pulling you into it, like whatever she was explaining was not just interesting but important. Peyton had spent years at Morgan's house, eating snacks from the kitchen, moving through the rooms without needing directions, and feeling comfortable in that easy, automatic way you feel in a second home. Over the previous year, Morgan had become very interested in creepypasta. The kind of creepypasta Morgan read was internet horror, strange stories, fake diary entries, fake police reports, and first-person accounts written to feel like real encounters with impossible things. Some of it was obviously fiction, but some of it had enough detail and enough confidence that even when you knew it was made up, it could still get under your skin. Peyton knew Morgan liked that stuff, and she knew Morgan could talk about it for a long time. Peyton did not really share the obsession, but she had sort of accepted it as one of Morgan's interests. There was another girl in the group too, named Anissa Wire. Anissa had become closer to Morgan over the past year, and she shared Morgan's interest in the same online horror stories. To Peyton, that did not seem especially alarming. It was just a thing the two of them liked, the same way kids got obsessed with a book series, or a game, or a band. Sometimes it felt weird, and sometimes Peyton did not like the feeling it gave her. But in her mind it still belonged in the category of kid horror stuff. On the evening of May 30th, 2014, Peyton packed an overnight bag and went to Morgan's house for a birthday sleepover. Anissa was there too. Peyton's mom dropped her off, and Peyton went inside the familiar way she always did, slipping into the house like she belonged there. The three girls settled in for the night, and for a while, nothing about it looked unusual. They ate pizza, watched things on the screen, and talked about the kind of things 12-year-olds talk about: school, music, summer plans, and little jokes that probably would not have made sense to anyone outside the room. At some point, Peyton went to use the bathroom. Then when she came back, Morgan and Anissa were looking at something together. It looked like a folder or some printed pages, maybe more of the horror material Morgan was always interested in. When Peyton walked in, they closed it up and moved it aside. Peyton noticed, but in that house with those friends, it did not feel like the kind of thing that needed an explanation. Later that night, the girls spread their sleeping bags across the floor and turned off the lights. Peyton lay there with a blanket pulled up around her shoulders, listening to the quiet sounds of Morgan's house, the refrigerator humming somewhere downstairs, the small movements of the other girls nearby, and the muffled stillness of home after everyone else had gone to bed. She thought about the next morning because the plan was to go to Davids Park. That sounded nice. So Peyton closed her eyes and let herself drift off in a place where she felt completely safe. At some point in the night, Peyton half woke to the sound of whispering. Morgan and Anissa were talking quietly in the dark. Peyton could not make out the words, and for a second she thought about asking what they were talking about, or asking them to be quiet. But she was tired, and it was easier to assume they were just scaring themselves with Slenderman stories again. So she rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, Peyton woke to the smell and noise of breakfast somewhere downstairs. She stayed in her sleeping bag for a little while, in that slow Saturday morning feeling where the whole day is still ahead of you and nothing feels urgent yet. Then she got up, found her shoes, and joined Morgan and Anissa downstairs. A little later, the three girls left the house and started toward Davids Park together. To Peyton, it was just a sleepover turning into a walk through the park with her friends. A short time later, a cyclist riding through Davids Park saw something near the edge of the trail. At first, it looked like someone lying in the bushes. Then it got closer and realized it was a girl. She was 12 years old, badly injured, and somehow still conscious. She had been stabbed 19 times. The cyclist called 911 immediately. While he waited for help, the girl managed to tell him she had crawled there herself from deeper in the woods. She had been trying to reach the road. She had been trying to survive. Paramedics arrived and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors realized just how close she had come to dying. One wound had missed her aorta by millimeters. Her liver and diaphragm had been punctured. The fact that she had moved at all, let alone crawled out of the woods toward help, was almost impossible to understand. At first, officers responding to the park did not have a clean explanation for anything. They had a child who had been attacked in the woods, but no adult suspect running from the scene, no obvious robbery, and no clear reason for why this had happened. Then, about 2 miles away, police stopped two 12-year-old girls walking along a highway. They were Morgan and Anissa. The two girls were calm and cooperative, but there was something deeply strange about that calmness. They did not act like children who had just escaped from something terrifying in the woods, and they did not act like children who fully understood why police were now focused on them. When officers asked where they were going, Morgan and Anissa said they were on their way to a forest about 100 miles north. They said there was a mansion there, and they said the mansion belonged to Slenderman. Inside their backpack, officers found a kitchen knife. Detective Thomas Casey, who was assigned to the case that morning, drove to the Waukesha County Sheriff's Department, trying to arrange the pieces in his head. Peyton was in the hospital with 19 stab wounds. Morgan and Anissa had been found walking along a highway with a knife in their backpack. And then there was the bizarre statement about a mansion in a forest and someone called Slenderman. In one sense, the case seemed to have moved very quickly. In every other sense, none of it made sense at all. Casey sat down across from the girls and opened his notebook. He later described those interviews as some of the strangest of his career, not because Morgan and Anissa were difficult, but because they were so willing to talk. They answered questions carefully, almost like they were relieved to explain the world as they saw it. And as Casey listened, he realized he was not just taking a statement about an attack in a park. He was listening to two children describe a reality that did not match his at all. Morgan and Anissa told Casey that Slenderman was real. They said they knew about him from stories and websites and videos online. They said he chose certain people, protected certain people, and had a mansion in the woods where those people could live with him. Casey had never heard anything like this in an interview room before. So at one point he stepped away from the girls, went to a computer, and did something he had never had to do in a case before. He looked up a fictional internet character. Slenderman had first appeared online in 2009. He was created for a website called Something Awful, which ran creative challenges for its users. One challenge asked people to submit fake paranormal images that looked convincing enough to pass, at first glance, as real. A man in Florida submitted a black and white photograph of children playing in a park. In the background, half hidden among the trees, stood a figure that was extremely tall and impossibly thin, with a dark suit, arms that looked slightly too long, and a blank white face with no eyes, no nose, and no mouth. The post called the figure Slenderman and presented the image like a recovered document connected to child disappearances. It was entirely made up. The creator said so. But it did not matter. The image spread, and soon other people began adding to it. They wrote first-person accounts, fake news articles, diary entries, police-style reports, and forum posts, all designed to feel like evidence of a real phenomenon. A whole mythology grew around Slenderman, and because thousands of anonymous people could build on the same idea, the characters started to feel less like one story and more like a world. In that world, Slenderman stalked children, appeared in old photographs, caused paranoia, and chose certain people to act for him. Those people were called proxies. A proxy, in the mythology, carried out Slenderman's will. In exchange, the proxy was protected, chosen, and made special in a way ordinary people were not. And somewhere inside all that lore was the idea that Slenderman had a mansion hidden deep in a forest. Casey scrolled through page after page of this material, reading stories that were fake but written with the confidence and detail of real testimony. As an adult detective sitting at a desk, he understood that it was fiction. But he also understood how different it might feel to a 12-year-old reading it late at night, alone in a bedroom, especially if another child was sitting beside her and insisting it was real. The more Casey read, the more the case shifted in his mind from a simple act of violence to something stranger and harder to map. Investigators went to the school, interviewed teachers, and spoke to the parents of all three girls. Morgan's parents knew she had been interested in creepypasta, and they had seen some of the printed material in notebooks, but they had understood it more like a phase or a fascination. They had not understood the depth of it. When police searched Morgan's school locker, they found more notebooks. There were drawings, notes about Slenderman, and pages of writing about what it meant to become a proxy. Investigators also began to piece together that Morgan and Anissa had been reading and talking about this material for months. Their friendship had become wrapped around the mythology, each conversation reinforcing the last, until the line between a scary story and a real obligation had started to disappear. Even then, Casey had to be careful. He could not simply hear the word Slenderman and decide the whole case was explained. He still had to ask whether both girls believed the same thing, whether one had pushed the other, whether someone online had encouraged them, whether the story was being used as an excuse after the fact, and whether Peyton had been chosen suddenly or long before that morning. So investigators kept digging. That was when they learned the park was not the beginning. Months earlier, at another sleepover, something had almost happened while Peyton slept in the same room as Morgan and Anissa. Investigators learned enough to understand that the December incident mattered, but before the full story could make sense, Casey had to understand the belief system the girls had been living inside. He had to understand the fear, the fantasy, the pressure, and the way two children could convince each other that a fictional character was not fiction at all. By the time investigators were finished, the attack at David's Park no longer looked sudden. It looked like the end point of something that had been building quietly for months inside bedrooms, notebooks, websites, sleepovers, and whispered conversations adults did not fully hear. Based on the girls' statements, the physical evidence, and what investigators later established, this is what police believe happened on the morning of May 31st, 2014. Before Peyton woke, the assailants were already lying in their sleeping bags, listening to the house around them, the refrigerator downstairs, the faint sounds of people beginning to move, and Peyton breathing quietly nearby. For months, the idea had grown between them, moving from stories to conversations to certainty, and finally to a plan. To them, Slenderman was real. The danger to their families was real, and proving themselves seemed like the only way to become protected, chosen, and allowed into the mansion in the woods. Months earlier, at another sleepover, the assailants had already come close. They had stood over Peyton while she slept, with a weapon nearby and the plan right there in front of them. But in that room, in the dark, the moment passed. Through the winter, that failure kept turning over until the next sleepover felt like another chance. Now, on the morning after the birthday sleepover, that chance had come back. The knife was inside the backpack, checked the night before after Peyton went to sleep. In the dark, the assailants had looked at each other and understood that this time they were supposed to finish what they had not finished before. When Peyton came downstairs, the morning still looked ordinary. She ate breakfast, looked at her phone, and laughed at something, while the assailants watched from across the room. Every normal thing she did seemed to sit beside the secret they were carrying, The glass in her hand, the sound of her voice, the way she trusted them enough not to question where the day was going. In their minds, the park was no longer just a park. It was the place where the ordinary world would end, and the path to Slenderman's mansion would begin. A little later, Peyton set out for David's park with him. It was late May, warm and bright, with blue sky overhead and a light breeze moving through the trees. Peyton talked as they walked, relaxed in the easy way a child is relaxed when she believes she is safe. The assailants answered enough to keep the morning feeling normal, but their attention kept moving ahead to the path, the trees, and the places where the road disappeared behind them. They were waiting for privacy, for the street sounds to fade, and for the path to bend far enough that there was nothing around them but trees, trail, and Peyton. When that moment came, they stopped. The assailants told Peyton they were going to play a game, and then they told her to get down on the ground. Peyton looked at them, confused, but still trusting them enough to do what they said. Then they moved on her. One assailant held Peyton down while the other pulled out the knife. Peyton fought immediately. She twisted, pushed, tried to get her arms between herself and the blade, tried to grab at the knife, and tried to pull free. She was 12 years old. She understood what was happening, and every part of her body tried to survive it. The wounds ended up on her arms and legs, as well as her torso, the defensive kind, the kind that shows someone was blocking, reaching, twisting, and refusing to give up. There were 19 wounds when it was over. For a moment, the assailants stood in the woods, breathing hard. What they had imagined for months was no longer imaginary. It had happened in front of them, to Peyton, who had slept beside them, eaten breakfast with them, and walked into the park because she trusted them. But in the reality, the assailants had built together. This was supposed to be the beginning of something else. Now they were supposed to walk north, find the forest, find the mansion, and be accepted by Slenderman. After that, the assailants gathered their things, picked up the backpack, walked out of the park, and turned north onto the road. In the sunshine, they started walking. They did not look back. They left Peyton there. Peyton was still conscious. Her liver had been punctured. Her diaphragm had been punctured. One wound had come within millimeters of her aorta. She should not have been able to move. But she was not going to stay in the woods, so she crawled through the brush, pushing herself forward until she could hear the trail and pull herself onto it. That was where the cyclist found her. Peyton survived. The assailants were Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire, Peyton's friends from the sleepover. Once investigators understood that, all the strange pieces of the case locked into place. The whispering in the dark was not just kids scaring each other for fun. The folder Peyton had seen was not just another pile of creepy stories. The walk to the park was not spontaneous. And Morgan and Anissa's calmness on the highway was not because nothing had happened, but because in their minds the most important part was still ahead of them. Morgan was the center of the belief. As investigators looked deeper into her background, they learned that she had experienced things other people around her did not experience for much of her life. Since early childhood, Morgan had described frightening presences and figures that felt real to her, including one she called the Big Man. Adults around her had not fully understood what those experiences meant. From the outside, her life could look ordinary, while inside, her reality had been different for a long time. Then Morgan found Slenderman. To most people, the mythology was a scary internet story. To Morgan, it read like a confirmation. A tall, faceless figure who existed just outside the visible world, who chose certain people, appeared near children, moved through forests, and had power over those who followed him. All of it seemed to match the private world she had already been living with. By the time she was 12, Morgan was not treating the stories like fiction. She believed them completely. Morgan was later diagnosed with early-onset childhood schizophrenia. Anissa's path into the belief was different. She did not appear to have experienced the same inner reality Morgan had. But over months of shared reading and conversation, Morgan's certainty became a force of its own. When you are 12 years old and your close friend believes something completely, day after day with hundreds of online stories seeming to back it up, it can become very difficult to hold a different conclusion. Together, Morgan and Anissa built a shared reality around a fictional character created for an internet creativity challenge. Peyton, who trusted Morgan, who spent the night in her house, who noticed the folder and thought nothing of it, became the person they believed they had to sacrifice. Morgan was found not guilty by reason of insanity in October 2017 and sentenced to 40 years of maximum commitment at a psychiatric institution. Anissa was found not guilty by reason of insanity in September 2017 and sentenced to 25 years. Anissa was released in September 2021, and her GPS monitoring bracelet was removed in September 2023. The case became one of the most widely discussed crimes of the decade. It sparked national conversations about internet safety for children, the power of online communities to shape belief, and the line between creative fiction and something more dangerous. The creator of Slenderman released a public statement urging people not to harm anyone in the character's name. Documentaries were made, books were written, and Waukesha spent a long time trying to understand what had happened in a quiet park on a Saturday morning. Years later, Peyton gave an interview. She said the attack had inspired her to pursue a career in medicine. She also said she still struggled and that she slept with a pair of broken scissors beside her bed. In July 2025, Morgan Geyser was approved for conditional release from the psychiatric institution and moved to a supervised group home in Madison, Wisconsin, with GPS monitoring as a condition of her release. On the night of November 22, 2025, she cut off the monitoring bracelet and walked out of the group home. 2 days later, police found her at a truck stop in Posen, Illinois, 170 miles south of Madison, sleeping on the sidewalk outside with a 42-year-old man. When officers asked for her name, she gave a false one. Then she went quiet. Eventually, she said she did not want to say who she was because she had done something really bad, and told them they could just Google it. Everything you just heard is based on real events. Some details have been reconstructed or dramatized for the sake of the story. But the core of it, Peyton, Morgan, Anissa, and what happened in those woods, that all happened. Thank you for listening to the SCP Labs podcast. If you enjoyed this one, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It genuinely helps more than you know. Until next time.